They were the greatest musical sensation the world has ever seen.
The Beatles transformed and changed the whole British scene, not just in music. They were a cultural phenomenon.
They were the greatest group that the world has ever known. Nobody can touch the Beatles. Nobody.
But behind the well-scrubbed front of Britain's Fab Four was a backstage world of sex, infidelity, and drug-fueled creativity.
You'd see people licking their lips all night and talking endlessly about stuff they have no idea, or slurring their words or throwing up on themselves.
I remember one night when they came to me and were saying, "Can you believe we all four made love to one girl?"
It was a complex story of political intrigue and behind-the-scenes manipulation, damaged imitation on a universal scale.
We were quite expecting, this is not an exaggeration, that somebody would take a pot shot at John Lennon on stage.
The Beatles were a class act, but after only 3 years on the road, this international pop sensation was breaking apart. Today, music written and performed by the Beatles is often withheld from those seeking to recreate their story. Every aspect of their image is policed by the company that they themselves created to control their world. This is the untold story of a cultural phenomenon, the backstage secrets of everybody's favorite Fab Four. Liverpool, 1956. American rock and roll has arrived. A teenager transforms himself into a teddy boy. He is besotted by his hero, Elvis Presley.
Well, almost everybody wanted to be a singer or play the guitar after they'd seen Elvis. I mean, Elvis was the one that changed the whole scene for everybody. And the Beatles were no different. He wanted to look like Elvis and have all the girls screaming at them, like was happening with Elvis.
For 15-year-old John Lennon is the beginning of the dream. Inspired by Elvis, he starts his own college band.
I was not really aware of who John was, apart from he was like the local teddy boy that was to be avoided because he was trouble.
At a church fete in Wilton in July 1957, Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, is approached by another pop star wannabe. 15-year-old Paul McCartney is out to impress.
He picked up a guitar and showed them how to play it, certain chords, because John had been taught to play banjo chords, not guitar chords. And when Paul was able to write out the lyrics to some songs, John and the Quarrymen were sold.
Next into the Quarrymen is George. George Harrison meets Paul McCartney on the number 86 bus. They go to the same school and get talking. 15-year-old George wants to be in the band, but 18-year-old John Lennon needs some persuading.
John always thought of George as this little kid. I don't want to know, I'm not having a kid in my group. And he had to, over a period of time, he had to be convinced that George was good enough to join the group.
John Lennon meets number 4 Beatle at Liverpool Art College. 18-year-old Stuart Sutcliffe is one of the most talented art students around. He and John become best mates. They share a flat and a love of art. By the late 1950s, the most famous musical partnership of modern times had begun. But it was an inauspicious start. The impressionable Beatles became friendly with beat poet Royston Ellis. This sophisticated southerner introduced them to the habit of a lifetime. Despite the squeaky clean image of what would become everybody's favorite pop sensation, hard drugs would come to define much of the Beatles story. And it all started here.
I was telling them, well, you know how people turn on in London? They, in fact, buy these nose inhalers from the chemists and take out the inside, open up the plastic nose inhaler, take out the strips, and then chew them. And you get a high. Whether they liked it or not, I don't know. But this was their first experience with drugs of any kind.
Back in 1960 Liverpool, it looked like the Beatles might be about to get their first big break. Local promoter Alan Williams had been sending bands to Hamburg. He thought he could get the Beatles a gig in Germany, but he had a problem: their music.
I already had a group working there called Howie Casey, and he wrote me a letter saying, what on earth are you thinking about? You've got a good thing in Hamburg, and you're going to send that bum group, the Beatles, over here. You're going to the whole scene up.
A bootleg recording made in 1960 is a rare insight into the shaky foundations on which the Beatles story is built. Despite the warnings, the Beatles got the job with Alan Williams. Drummer Pete Best completed the lineup, and the teenage band headed out for what would be their initiation into a world of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
They were only young boys who'd never even been to the Isle of Man for a holiday, never mind going to Hamburg, and there they were thrust into this Wild West situation.
Fired up on drugs and alcohol, the Beatles radiated an explosive energy on stage.
I think everybody was almost stoned every night.
Germany, 1960. The Beatles were playing their first professional gig in Hamburg's red light district. Despite being strapped for cash most of the time, the band had an image to maintain.
They had black leather jackets and tight black pants and pointed shoes, all black, and they had that Elvis haircut, those quiffs and ducktails. And I thought they looked great.
The Beatles were playing night after night, sometimes 6 hours at a go. With little time for regular meals and not much sleep, there was only one way to survive: drugs.
Today, 2 pills is like nose cocaine.
They could drink more, they could make longer love, they could play harder.
You know, you've been awake all night, you're active, and you talked.
I think everybody was almost stoned every night.
Fired up on drugs and alcohol, the Beatles radiated an explosive energy on stage. And as they notched up the hours, the music got better.
You discover either I've got it, I've got this talent, or I've got something that, you know, is valuable. Or I haven't, and they've discovered pretty soon that they have.
They were sticking always together and talking to each other about music. And I also saw how the girls were crazy about him. And I think a band who has the girls behind them, that's the half of the success.
This was life on the edge. Sex, and plenty of it, was high on everyone's agenda. For the Beatles and other English bands living in Hamburg's red light district, it came on tap.
There were, of course, girls, like they later on groupies, and they could choose. And they took them for a, how do you say it? I don't know if you can say it in front of the camera, for a or whatsoever.
It wasn't just girls that were on offer to young English rockers. Monica's Bar was Hamburg's notorious transvestite club. For one or two English musicians, Monica's was just another part of the Hamburg experience.
One night, Monica said, come and look. One of your boys is in a separate. And I said, who is it? She said, one of the Beatles. I said, let me have a look. She said, be careful. Look, only, sneaky like. So, but what I did, I grabbed that curtain and put it on its side. There was sitting John in the position with that girl, and he felt really ashamed. He did like that, and I said, John, don't worry, man. I did that all before.
For John Lennon, Hamburg provided an escape from the sexual norms with which he'd grown up in middle-class Liverpool.
He would prefer anybody's company apart from, say, the normal run-of-the-mill type of person on the street. Anybody's company who were a bit weird, a bit odd, because that's the way he saw himself as well.
John Lennon later said, "We grew up in Hamburg." But this newfound freedom in a place where anything went exposed a dark side to Lennon's personality, one that would come to define this founding member of the Beatles.
He looked really like the quintessential rocker to me. He looked dangerous. It's hardly imaginable, but this guy looked dangerous at that time because he was very, those kind of aggressiveness, restrained aggressiveness.
In December 1960, the Beatles' Hamburg gig came to an abrupt end. 17-year-old George Harrison was chucked out of Germany for working underage and without a work permit. Paul and Pete were accused of arson after setting light to a condom in their digs. They were arrested, put in jail for the night, and kicked out of Germany the next day. With half their band missing, John and Stuart headed home as well. But for Stuart Sutcliffe, this was the end of the road. His heart had gone out of the band, and he retreated from it. In little over a year, this founding member of what would become the musical sensation of the century would be dead, struck down, aged 21, by a brain hemorrhage.
I asked John, well, what's the difference actually between Pete Best and Ringo Starr? And John's short answer was, Pete Best was a good drummer, Ringo Starr is a good Beatle.
Back home, it was clear that a lot had happened to the young rockers from Liverpool. In January 1961, the Beatles played a venue that was going to turn their story around. They were an instant hit at Liverpool's Cavern Club.
They looked different from the other groups. They had the fantastic sound. The kids loved them. The Cavern was transformed once the Beatles started appearing there.
And the Beatles were about to meet someone at the Cavern who would transform their lives. Brian Epstein was the eldest son of respectable middle-class Jewish parents. He ran Nems, the biggest record store in Liverpool, and was always on the lookout for new talent. The 9th of November 1961. Brian Epstein had heard about the band from Germany and visited the Cavern for the first time. Epstein's assistant at Nems was Alistair Taylor.
We went in, paid our 1 and 6 or whatever it was, and Brian and I feeling very out of place because we were in suits and, I think he had his briefcase with him. And we sat at the back, very embarrassed, surrounded by all these kids. Brian said, "What did you think?" And I said, "I think there's something there." And he said, "So do I."
Within weeks, the Beatles were signed up with Brian Epstein. It was a big step in the right direction.
They respected him for his sophistication, his smartness, he very clearly belonged to a higher class.
For Epstein, there was only one real star of the Beatles. A closet homosexual, Brian was bowled over by the force of John Lennon. Aware of his manager's leanings, John Lennon didn't discourage Epstein's fascination.
Oh yeah, John knew about it. John wasn't above using that, like in the sense of leading Brian along, you know, because he's managing him, you know.
In July 1962, Brian got the boys their first recording deal with EMI's Parlophone label. But there was a price to pay. Pete Best, the drummer who had helped his band up the difficult first rungs of the ladder, was dropped on the eve of the Beatles' first recording session.
John said it was the most shameful thing they ever did. John felt it was shameful. He didn't want to know at the time, you know, because he got on well with Pete Best.
Pete Best was replaced by Ringo Starr. Despite the guilt, John Lennon knew that Starr's outgoing personality was right for the direction in which his band was now moving.
I asked John, well, what's the difference actually between Pete Best and Ringo Starr? And John's short answer was, Pete Best was a good drummer, Ringo Starr is a good Beatle.
With the final lineup in place and a recording deal in the offing, there was just one thing left to do. It was time for Brian Epstein to shed the Beatles' rocker image and polish up their act.
He took them to the Empire to see the Shadows perform, and at the end of the act they bowed, and he said, that's what you must do, bow at the end of the act. John Lennon went furious, bowing in front of people, how horrible. Paul loved it. This was up to Paul's type of thing, what show business should be.
Next, the clothes. It was a long way from the Beatles' hardcore rock and roll days in Hamburg.
For us, they sold out when they cleaned up, when they started looking pretty, and it was a very big transition, you know, from the scruffy look and the cigarette hanging in the, and you know, we were not very clean in those days, I think.
He did take the earthiness out of them. He took the rock and roll. He took what I loved out of the band, and I've always maintained that the world's never seen the Beatles like we saw them. They've never been as wild as they were.
As the recently polished Beatles stood on the edge of fame, they were entering a world of sexual and political intrigue beyond their dreams. By spring 1963, the band had two number ones, Please Please Me and From Me to You. Nobody could believe how fast things were moving. The Beatles were the group with the country's best-selling single and album. Beatlemania was born. Although virtually no controversial news leaked out at the time, a sense of the Beatles' backstage secrets has emerged in recent years.
One of the boys would come to us and say, look, been a bit naughty. And he's like, okay, give me the name and the address and who she is.
Despite the backstage shenanigans, serious relationships were forming within the Beatles' camp. John Lennon had been dating Cynthia Powell since 1958. When Cynthia discovered, in the summer of 1962, that she was pregnant, John married her. But for Cynthia Lennon, her early marriage and pregnancy were a nightmare of constant subterfuge.
Well, Cynthia was always in the background. She was always kept in the background, and one of the reasons was that's the way Brian Epstein wanted it. He wanted them to be the biggest band in the world, and he thought if it came out that one of them was married, they won't be as big.
Overnight, Cynthia Lennon became the Beatles' guilty secret. John Lennon's intrepid sexual adventures continued.
If you're asking me, did I have a personal experience? I can say that yes, but there was a girl between us.
The Beatles were the darlings of the day. They could do nothing wrong. They were cheeky, irreverent even, but everyone loved the boys from Liverpool.
People used to accuse Brian and myself, particularly Brian, and me, because I was involved, of teaching them what to say at press conferences. Now, can you imagine anything more stupid?
I'd just like to say the same as the others. Thanks for the Purple Hearts. Silver! Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, Harold.
Nobody in the beginning believed that they could be that funny, that naturally humorous and sharp, right? But they were.
But as the Beatles frontman, John Lennon, jested with the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, life for his secret wife was far from fun. When Cynthia Lennon gave birth to Julian in April 1963, it took John a week to visit his wife and son in hospital, and he wasn't hanging around. Soon after this visit, he left for Barcelona with his manager. John Lennon's brief holiday with Brian Epstein, just days after the birth of his son, continues to raise questions about the nature of the relationship between manager and star. Knowing Brian was in love with him, and at a time when homosexuality was illegal in Britain, did Lennon intend to take things further?
I personally believe that he got up to nothing, but there is also the other side of the argument, that is that John Lennon was an intrepid sexual adventurer. He would have done anything. He would have turned down nothing. He would have tried out anything. And so what he may have tried out in Barcelona for the fun and thrills of it, who knows?
Protected by the secrecy surrounding his marriage and fatherhood, John Lennon's intrepid sexual adventures continued. As the Beatles rose to fame, Lennon kept up with his old friend, Royston Ellis.
I would think that John was ambisexual. He was curious, he was willing to experiment. If you're asking me, did I have a personal experience? I can say that yes, but there was a girl between us.
By the beginning of 1964, the Beatles had taken Europe, and it was time to go global. On the 7th of February, the band left for America. Cynthia Lennon, who had been kept behind closed doors for 18 months, was finally allowed to accompany her husband on tour.
No ack-ack reached this invading plane arriving at New York City's Kennedy Airport, but the pandemonium created by the 3,000 teenagers on hand to greet the sortie of Britain's bristling Beatles is something one might expect from a collision of planets.
The Beatles were forced to exist in the shadow of superstardom, a secret life behind closed doors.
They couldn't go down to the corner shop and get a packet of cigarettes at the height of Beatlemania. They'd have been lynched, you know, and so they couldn't do anything.
They didn't like being sort of virtually under house arrest, even if it was 5-star house arrest. They never got to do anything in the way of sightseeing.
Larry Kane, a radio journalist who travelled with the Beatles, shared many hidden backstage moments with the band.
One of the problems they had was there was no release. You know, basically their life on tour, 25, 26 cities in 33 days, was get on the airplane, go to the hotel, take the limousine, go to the place, come back, go to the airplane.
Despite being constantly mobbed by millions of young women, getting personal on tour was a problem for the Beatles. Fans were off limits in the Epstein camp. If the boys wanted girls, the girls could be bought in.
The promoter walked in with about 8 or 9 painted kind of women who looked like they weren't just walking the streets for exercise. And he said, "Gentlemen, take your pick." Epstein walked out right away, which should have been a clue to me about his sexual preference, but I really didn't know, nor did I care. And some of them took their pick.
An article appears in the London Evening Standard in which John Lennon makes the mistake of comparing the Beatles to Jesus.
I'm not anti-Christ or anti-religion or anti-God, you know.
March the 4th, 1966. An article appears in the London Evening Standard in which John Lennon makes the mistake of comparing the Beatles to Jesus. When the piece reached America on the 29th of July, the wording seemed to indicate that Lennon thought the Beatles were bigger than Jesus.
By the time it was splashed across the cover of Datebook magazine, a teeny bopper fanzine in the States, it looked and sounded completely different. It sounded like a boast. It sounded like he was saying, oh, we're bigger than all the religions on earth by now.
Beatles records were burned. The Ku Klux Klan threatened to picket concerts. And there were even death threats.
Our fantastic Beatle boycott is still in effect. Don't you forget what the Beatles have said. And don't forget to take your Beatle records and your Beatle paraphernalia to any one of our 14 pickup points in Birmingham, Alabama, and turn them in this week if possible.
2 weeks later, the Beatles left Britain for their third US tour, only too aware of the potential dangers that lay ahead. Every concert was dogged by fear of an assassination attempt.
We were quite expecting that somebody would take a pot shot at John Lennon on stage. And at one point in the middle of the concert, somebody let off a firecracker in the audience, which sounded just like a rifle shot. And not only did our eyes shoot to John, but also the other three Beatles turned in to look at him. And, you know, the great relief that, no, he wasn't going down.
August 1966. The Beatles had been on the international circuit for just 3 years, but plagued by death threats and worn down by life on the road, they'd had enough. At the end of their third American tour, the Beatles announced that they were giving up life on the road in favor of studio music production. It was nearly a decade since the band first met as teenagers in Liverpool. 6 years since their early rock and roll gigs in Hamburg. With their retreat into the studio came the most creative period in the Beatles' musical career. But it was the beginning of the end for the band. Old Hamburg friend Klaus Voormann received a rare invitation from Lennon to listen to the new album, Revolver.
He said, come down to the studio and listen to what we have done. And you could feel he was very proud of it. And I came to the studio and I was floored, because it was, now you listen to it, you say, okay, but in those days, it was such a milestone. It was a change.
The Beatles had come a long way since their days as a rock and roll cover band. By the late 1960s, the Beatles, with John Lennon and Paul McCartney at the helm, were being feted as a 20th century musical phenomenon.
It was that magical star-crossed, once-in-a-lifetime Rodgers and Hammerstein, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Lennon and McCartney. You know, those partnerships don't happen often.
To the world, the Beatles presented a united front, producing albums and fulfilling contracts to satisfy the public's insatiable demand. But behind the scenes, the strain was beginning to show. In the decades to come, George Harrison would more than prove his worth as a musician in his own right. But locked in a studio with his fellow Beatles, this wannabe songwriter struggled to be heard.
He asked for some help with his songs from both John and Paul, and they were very reluctant to help him. They didn't want to help him whatsoever.
He was kept down by them, but because they wanted their songs. John and Paul would be battling to get their songs on against each other, you know, and having little tiffs.
Ever the diplomat, even Ringo Starr was to feel the pressure. During the recording of the White Album, the Beatles drummer walked out of the studio and didn't go back for 2 weeks. No longer bound together by life on the road, the Beatles were coming unstuck.
From that point, when they stopped doing live gigs, there was a certain spirit that was necessary for this band, Beatles, was gone.
And there was more dissatisfaction in the Beatles camp. The fate of Brian Epstein has always been shrouded in secrecy. The manager was devastated by his band's decision to stop touring, added to which he was being blackmailed by an ex-boyfriend. By the end of 1966, Brian Epstein was losing his grip on the Beatles and on himself. In the year after his band stopped touring, he even tried to commit suicide.
They had less need of him. I think they also deliberately began towards the end to steer clear of him. I mean, he was so unavailable that was very easy for them to do. They wanted to drop the ties that they had had in the past.
Brian Epstein died of a drugs and alcohol overdose on the 27th of August 1967. The coroner's verdict was accidental death. The Beatles thought they could go it alone, but in the wake of Brian's death, they were stranded.
John, where would you be today without Mr. Epstein?
I don't know.
Are you driving down to London tonight?
Yes, somebody's taking us down here.
You heard the news this afternoon, I believe.
Yes.
And Paul's already gone down?
Yes.
I see.
When he heard about Brian's death, one of the first things he said, well, we're now. And he meant it.
Who's going to get our passports for us? Who's going to book our airline tickets? You know? Because they didn't do anything. They didn't. I mean, I used to sign their traveller's checks at forms. I used to forge their signatures for contracts. You know, they didn't know what was going on around their lives because it was all taken care of. Suddenly Brian's dead, and it's just like.
The death of Brian Epstein was another turning point for the Beatles. What began before Brian's death now took on a new momentum. The Beatles set up their own company, Apple, in an attempt to take complete control of every aspect of their working lives.
The Beatles had this obsessive idea that instead of having an army of different people at arm's length from them, that they should collect all they needed to survive professionally in one building under one roof, and that they would engineer all this. Everything was possible.
He really was happiest in his life with May Pang.
It was such a confusing time, because here's the man who professed how much he loves me, and he went back.
The Beatles were superstars, worshipped around the world, but in private, things were unraveling. Paul McCartney and actress Jane Asher began dating in 1963. They were the 60s golden couple. The pair got engaged in December 1967, just weeks before the Beatles' trip to India. But with Jane away on theatre tours much of the time, Paul McCartney was left struggling with single life. Just a few months into his engagement to Jane, Paul had an affair with Francie Schwartz, a young American hoping to interest the Beatles in a film idea. Francie remembers the first time Paul turned up, unannounced, on her doorstep.
He had been to a wedding, a family wedding, with Jane. I let him in. We ran up the stairs. We didn't take the lift. And he followed me up the stairs, and I said, what's going on? And he said, it's F Day. F Day. And we went in the living room, and he sat in a chair, and I sat in his lap, and we necked.
And there was a surprise in store for the other woman in Paul McCartney's life. When Jane Asher returned home during a tour break, she found Francie Schwartz in her bed. Jane dumped Paul. Only 3 months after his very public breakup with Jane, Paul McCartney was living with someone new.
You can't be without a woman for too long. It's always been the same. It could be the same one, like it was with Linda, for years. But you cannot do it without having a bird.
When did you decide to get married, Paul?
About a week ago.
What prompted
Paul McCartney married Linda Eastman just 7 months after the breakup of his engagement to Jane Asher.
Linda, how do you feel about it all? You're obviously terribly happy. How are you feeling this morning?
Terribly happy.
That sounds good enough.
Unquote.
1 week later, on the 20th of March 1969, John Lennon married Yoko Ono following the breakup of his 6-year marriage to Cynthia. The introduction of Yoko Ono to the Beatles' inner circle was a further body blow to an already fragmenting group.
John would not do anything whatsoever without her being at his right hand or his left, on his shoulder. It was just like, in the studio, she was there all the time. I mean, the rule in those days was, still a working class idea. You don't take your wife to work.
George hated Yoko and wouldn't have anything to do with Yoko, and John was upset about their attitude towards Yoko, so he was getting very frustrated.
And then in the end, John and Yoko stopped going into the studio unless John was needed to do things. It was he became a part-time Beatle. Yeah.
By the beginning of 1969, Apple, the band's dream for its very own micro-world, was in a complete mess. There was only one way to save the Beatles from financial ruin: new management. But as interested parties gathered, the band was torn apart. Paul wanted his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, to take over. John thought Paul was trying to take control and backed Alan Klein, a ruthless lawyer from New York. After some persuading, George and Ringo lined up behind John. Alan Klein got the gig. He saved the boys from bankruptcy, but for the Beatles, this was the end of the road. By 1970, both Paul and John had announced that they were leaving the band.
Alan Klein's all-time ambition was to manage the Beatles, and the day he achieved it, they broke up.
After the split, John Lennon famously made his home in New York with Yoko Ono. To the world, they were the match made in heaven. But within just 2 years, Yoko Ono had had enough. She wanted Lennon out of her life. Incredibly, she asked the couple's assistant, May Pang, to take John off her hands.
She goes, May, I must talk to you. And I looked at her and I said, yes. She goes, John and I are not getting along. And she says, he's going to start seeing other people. And I said, really? And I said, I'm sorry to hear that. She goes, yes, but it's okay. He needs to find somebody, he needs to go with somebody that would be very caring and be nice to him. Well, you don't have a boyfriend. I think you should go out with him. And at that very moment, I just dropped my pen and pad and I said, but I don't want your husband.
Nevertheless, May Pang began the affair Yoko Ono had encouraged. In 1973, she and John Lennon left New York to live in LA for what has come to be known as Lennon's lost weekend. But this period of John Lennon's life lasted nearly 2 years and was a productive and happy time. During the course of his relationship with May, John lived on a beach in California. It was 3 years since the acrimonious breakup of his band, but as Lennon relaxed with his new lover, he welcomed old friends to his home.
When we were at the beach house, we had McCartney coming by, so it was like a bunch of people during the day. So McCartney and his family, at that time was Stella and Mary, and Heather. They were running around, and they were quite young.
Ringo Starr also spent time at Lennon's beach pad. Suddenly, any hard feelings were put on hold, and there was even talk of a possible musical reunion.
John had asked me, he said, what would you think? Would it be a good idea if I started to write with Paul again? And if I could tell you, I felt like I was in The Exorcist when my head spun around so quickly, and I said, I was so taken aback, and I said, it would be great.
Lennon and McCartney, I claim, is like brothers. In other words, love and hate going hand in hand.
But a Beatles reunion was not to be. In January 1975, John Lennon left May Pang to get back with his wife, Yoko, in New York.
It was such a confusing time because here's the man who professed how much he loves me, and he went back. And yet, he never stopped loving me, and I knew that in the end because he couldn't stop coming over to see me.
Larry Kane, who travelled with the Beatles on their American tours, recollects a conversation with John Lennon in the turbulent months after his affair with May.
He had mentioned to me that he really was happiest in his life with May Pang. And I didn't know much about her at the time. By the way, very few people did. People knew that they were involved. But there was no legend of John and Yoko and May Pang and how they were introduced until much later.
Following John Lennon's return to Yoko Ono in New York, all plans of collaborating with his old band were dropped.
Any thoughts of going to see Paul or writing with him just went out the window. I mean, it wasn't there anymore. It was never encouraged. Yoko would always say to him, and I've heard him say, you don't need to do this. He used to tell me this himself. He says, Yoko told me I don't need to do this.
She was a very strong influence on John and may well have been telling him that he could do best on his own. But I still think that at the back of John's mind would be this sort of fascination of wanting to get back with the first girlfriend, if you like. In other words, to get back with Paul that he had so much history with.
We could have had it. I'm just angry that it didn't happen. Because I know that John wanted to do it. And I'm sorry for crying.
Five years later, John Lennon was shot dead. The dream that had started 2 decades earlier was over. The Beatles changed all our lives forever. But in their hidden backstage world, dreams turned to disappointment as everybody's favorite Fab Four buckled under the pressure of universal superstardom.